So let's talk about Robert Creeley's I Know a Man. Let's talk about the video discussion that we see in ModPo and how we view it as teachers and how we might bring it into our own classrooms or advise others who are thinking about bringing ModPo and one of the videos into their classrooms. And I think we should watch it and talk about it. We'll do a sort of behind the scenes chatter about it the way you do in the bonus features sections of a DVD movie.
I was thinking more like football analysis.
Game tape.
Game tape.
This is game tape.
All right.
So we're talking about Robert Creeley's very famous, much anthologized poem, I Know a Man. And usually Creeley's associated with the Black Mountain School of Poetry, but Creeley was someone who really helped form the community, or as he put it, the company of new American poets, crossing communities. And in this poem, he seems to have some kind of relationship with the beat poetry.
I notice already that they're all looking down at the text. That's not always true.
No.
There's something about this poem, even I'm blurbing on about context, and they're looking at the text. I just have to point that out. This is a poem where people just look at the text.
I also noticed that you're doing a lot of contextualizing, which you often do in these videos, and we all often do in the classroom. But there's a way in which you're contextualizing Creeley that's saying something about the history, but also about the practice. His emphasis on the company, on the community, has to do specifically with the moment of the New American Poets, but also with an approach to poetry.
Right, and it's meant to be a setup of this strange non-communalism of this car ride, creating some kind of irony, possibly a critique of the beat. Drive fast mode. And what Emily says, I think it's Emily, is so brilliant that it launches us. You know, what's so exciting about this poem? So let's hear what she says.
Maybe the laughter in that sort of Harvard reading is a little pretentious, but it is...
Oh, you're referring to one of the many recordings we have on Penn Sound of Creeley reading this poem, and one of them is at Harvard.
Yes, I am.
And the Harvard audience laughs at the end. Why do you think they laugh?
Well, because there's something about punchline. Is this person... The way I read it is he's going on this sort of existential, philosophical jag behind the wheel. This speaker of the poem.
Hi.
Yeah, and it's this sort of...
Who's he talking to?
A man he either knows or doesn't know. Someone he thinks he knows but doesn't know that well.
So who's driving?
The speaker of the poem.
The speaker. So presumably John is in the passenger seat, or
John,
John, as it were.
Yeah.
And what's the punchline?
The punchline is he's wondering, what do we do in the darkness? What do we deploy against the sort of uncertainty and sadness? And he's sort of already deployed it, isn't he? He has the car. He's in the car. He's driving. And sort of by asking those questions, he incapacitates himself from actually finding answers.
Oh, you went big right away. Why do you think they laughed?
Because we all sort of know someone like this, right? It's who asks these questions but doesn't attend to someone who has all the philosophical parts but none of the practical parts. Or he does, but he forgets about it, and he has to drive the car rather than just talk about the car.
So when I turned to get away from my failure as a teacher to elicit the basics, Emily wound up teaching the whole poem. So now it was great, but now we're done.
What do we do now? This is only like a minute and a half into the video, right? And we're kind of done.
Yeah. And you were worried it would all go too long, right?
No matter how, I've taught this poem many times, but you just don't know how it's going to happen, do you?
Yeah. And it's amazing watching it now to realize how quickly, like, some of the basic first things that you might do with the poem in the class happens within like 10 seconds. Like, addressing who the speaker is, who the John is,
right.
Like figuring out how to negotiate the I.
And she stayed with it. She had something to say, but I kept interrupting her to get that stuff out. She answered all that well, and then still stayed on the train. And I think the moment that I saved it from digression caused by my grilling her about the narrative situation was when I said, okay, so why do you think they laughed at Harvard? But I also had to footnote the Harvard because she said the Harvard audience, and people watching the video wouldn't know that unless I had to. So I had to fill in the footnote, quiz her about the narration, and she still stayed on it. That's how good she is. But I saved the day by asking her, why did they laugh? So it's, if you look at a pedagogy that seems very open because it's participatory, don't be fooled in thinking that the teacher is not being pretty rigorous about keeping people to a certain set of issues.
Right.
So that we cover those issues. Coverage is, you can be participatory in the classroom, but still cover a lot of stuff, I guess, just to be sort of on your toes.
What are the options in this poem?
So I asked it
The
again.
options to me are either talk or drive.
Talk or drive. Right. And can we abstract? Talk or drive, or what or what?
Trying to get the binary.
Think or do. Which of the two does the poem as a poem ally itself with? With which of the two does the poem ally itself?
I think speaking, but in this very concentrated sense, right? Driving provides a space of enclosure and containment for these two passengers, and it kind of forces them to converge on their differences.
How else does it align itself with speaking?
It's words.
It's words. It's a poem.
Very in control.
To what extent does it ally itself with driving? I love this. Nobody knows what.
He's kind of, throughout the entire, you realize in the last stanza when you have the voice of the passenger kind of say, yo, like, look
reality,
at me.
man. We're in a car.
You kind of, I mean, driving is such a secondhand action, or it's something that's so easy to kind of just do without thinking. It's like you can go on auto drive.
I suppose, okay.
And so it seems as if he's just kind of on this auto drive mode, and he has to have someone kind of like pull him out of it and be like.
So she didn't answer my question, though I set up the binaries. She, at 8 minutes and 25 seconds into this lesson, is the final person to speak. Everyone has now spoken. And with my hands, I showed there was excitement. Like, I now have all the people speaking. So because normally, if someone didn't answer my question and I'm insistent about it, I would normally say, no, well, let's hold off on that. But Allie was the last person to speak. And so and she said something very interesting. So I was really conscious of the fact that we now rounded it, and it sort of didn't matter where we're going to, even though I didn't entirely agree with what she said.
And watching this video again, I keep thinking about how the video in itself is really useful, I think, for a classroom setting. Like if, one could ask the students to keep track of the questions that Al is asking, and then write about why they think certain questions get repeated. And then, what does that tell you about what we need to be doing as our own class and as readers of this poem? What's at stake? Why are these questions continuing to be pushed?
And then there are teachers who could take notes. Like I myself, I realized reviewing this that there's a moment where I just learned by talking and teaching. I learned something about the poem I hadn't thought of. And it's something like this. So we get to the binarism of talking and doing in the poem. Clearly the poem sees itself as talking, and therefore the speaker, or Creeley, is going to ironize that. But in what way is the poem driving? And as soon as I said that, I thought, what a fucking great question. Because driving and digressing and veering, just walking around, the driverless car at the end to Elsie, these are important points in modernism, where the poems go where they're going to go. And this poem is very digressive in its grammar and syntax.
And I remember...
And it's driving. I guess when I asked that question, I got very excited. And I haven't answered it for them, and I don't think I do. I think they figure it out. This poem is driving as much as it's talking.
Yeah, and I have two thoughts about that. Number one, I remember someone in ModPo starting a really fascinating discussion thread about how the poem itself is driving. So that's, people already have run with that idea after watching this video, which has been really exciting. And two, I can imagine in certain classroom settings pausing the video at that point and asking students to run with the there's another activity.
Or drive with it.
Go somewhere with this idea of like, okay, write a poem that drives, write a poem that talks, or write a poem that thinks driving is the answer to X, get out of a dilemma or face a problem, and then write a poem that does the other thing.
Yeah.
You know, and have them just kind of dwell in that binary for a little while and spend time with it.
Or you even think about what the difference between driving with direction and driving without direction is, right? I think that would help kind of think about the larger question in the class, the course in our poetics,
right,
about directionality versus openness.
Objectives, goals, endings, closure, all that stuff.
Right.
That's
authority,
really what's at
control,
stake here.
right? Because there's also like trouble with control here, right?
The whole thing is a struggle. The teacher trying to just resist the temptation. Yeah, you want to create a setting where everybody finishes the job and feels like some rigorous work was being done, rather than an anything goes situation entirely, where people feel like, well, we had a good talk, but I'm not sure we know what we said.
Right.
Somewhere between those two things. Yeah.
It's funny, this poem is acting out that, right? That's what this is all about.
Yeah, exactly. Can you say more about that?
Well, just that, I keep feeling like what we're seeing here is, in terms of both the participation and critique of beat, personality and habits and aesthetics, right? That it's like part of what's happening here is that it could just go far-flung and lose itself and just be ambling on in this uncontrolled line, but then it also looks out where it's going and it interrupts itself. And so I think the conversation is also doing that same thing, oddly enough, right?
Well, not oddly enough, right?
Well, you're directing it, I suppose, to some degree, but it seems like it's coming out of the poem too, right? Like, because if you talk about swerving and you talk about driving and you talk about talking and what their relationship is, the truth is in this poem, it's like both things constantly threaten to go out of control, but then they're constantly getting reeled back in. And actually the shape of the poem compared to the shape, if there is, well, there's a shape of Kerouac, it's like reining that in a little, but still threatening to kind of go off that way too.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Now I think about the chaos of the very beginning of this discussion.
Yeah.
If I'd only at the time saw how appropriate that was, I would have said something about it.
Yeah, right.
I think now in retrospect, you see that the best way to get into this poem is to go somewhere.
And I can imagine using this video in a lesson plan that I've used in a few different settings where I sandwich I Know a Man between William Carlos Williams's introduction to the wedge in 1944, in which he says a poem is a large or small machine made out of words, and a later piece, I think from the early 2000s or thereabouts, by Brian Kim Steffens, in which he takes I Know a Man and turns it into what he calls I Know a Man one letter at a time. And it's a video basically of I Know a Man typed on a typewriter one letter at a time, and they flash on the screen one letter at a time. So I talk about this poem as a rest stop I'm sorry, along the road, basically like the American fascination with the machine, American poet's fascination with the machine.
And then there's the whole current of drive, she said.
Yes.
Because the gendering of this driving is pretty beat, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
absolutely.
Except that it's about to crash and it needs to be stopped.
But the critique is, Creeley's critique is very much from within a masculine imagination,
right,
even though he's standing against it.
Yeah.
It's still a drive, he said.
Absolutely.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And then that makes me think that this poem is just really, as Al said in the video, so much about binaries and binary thinking. There's poetry and then there's the machine. And my point in that lesson is troubling the distinction between the two things. Is technology separate from what we call beauty or language or expression?
Or us and our bodies, right? Yeah.
Well, maybe it's worth ending this conversation by talking about the pleasures of teaching. Since we're talking as teachers, we rarely get to do this. I'll start, but I'm dying to hear what you guys think. Watching this gave me pleasure. Watching the close reading of Some Trees, which is a poem I love, and I think it's successful. I have to wince. There's something about this. The questions, the relaxed approach, the good listening, and feeling at the end of 16 minutes that this was good, this worked out. I didn't know how the hell this was going to work. Again, no notes. But in the close reading that starts from the beginning to the end, you don't really need notes because you're going to go phrase by phrase and you're going to accumulate a close reading. So I kind of knew where we're going. Here, I had no idea, which is obviously appropriate. I had really no idea how this was going to go. No plan at all. And everybody got to talk, and what they said was good, and I got a few words in, and it just felt really good. And it's such a pleasure. And isn't it such a pain as opposed to the pleasure when it doesn't go well, right? I mean, boy, I can't sleep that night. I feel bad. I feel betrayed. I keep emailing the students saying, yeah, it'll get better or something like that.
They're like, what do you mean it's fine?
What do you mean it's fine? Anyway, what about the pleasures and pains?
I mean, specific to the video, one of the reasons why I like this particular video so much is because I feel like it's a model. It kind of makes me feel like I want to try something outside of my comfort zone in the classroom, even though the pain might happen. But because it's very clear that the investment in the poem is of a very specific register, and it's really exciting. And it kind of makes me, as a teacher who teaches this poem, want to try and go to a different place and see what, what might happen then.
I think that, for me, this is one of those great poems in ModPo where there's just so much that you can let go of control and have a good time. I mean, I enjoy risking the pain of that. When I first started teaching, I used to try to really control things, and I really worried about completeness and getting everything. And I just started to let go of that, mostly because I started remembering when I was a student, I didn't get 10% of this, right? When I took English 88 with Al, however many years ago, I read a bunch of this stuff, but I'm still reading it, and I'm still getting it, and I'm still having new ideas.
Or still not getting it.
That's what, either.
Dickinson.
Both.
Wow.
Right. And teaching is
that?
amazing when you open it up to the students a little more. You learn things. They have different There are certain poems I feel like I never get the same reading out of twice with students.
To Elsie.
It's so exciting. Oh, to Elsie. Because I have a lot of students who identify with Elsie and are freaked out, but have all these other things. There's just so much to be gained in letting go and letting it happen and learning from it. Teaching and learning are together, like driving and talking, or crashing and not crashing.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and I also am thinking a lot about how the poems teach us how to read them. They teach us how to teach them. These are all the notes you need to a certain extent. Like the poem tells you how to do it. It doesn't give away all the answers. You have to find them in the poem. You have to work with the poem. You can't simply apprehend it. You have to do it in dialogue. You have to do it with your students.
Did you just say that the poems teach us how to teach them?
I did.
Yeah.
That
Believe
is
it.
so right.
Yeah.
And aren't we doing honor to the poems and the poets and the aesthetic?
Yeah.
If we let the poems guide us, here's how I should be taught. Don't violate me. Try to teach in the spirit and the mode and the style and the tenor and the language. Talk about letting language into the room. Let the poets' linguistic position into the room.